Well, big picture, there's at least three major stages of landing a dream job: applying to the job, screening with either the internal hiring recruiter in HR or potentially a third party, and then actually doing the interview with their hiring manager or future boss. So I was wondering if we could break down each one and kind of look at each one carefully, starting with applying and going through the resume process. Um, do you have any advice, kind of generically or broadly, about what you can do to have your resume stand out for the job that you're applying to?
Yes, typically, and we're going to be generalizing here, but generally speaking, you need to keep the resume on 2 pages. Don't get overly creative on the resume unless the job you're applying for specifically asks for that. So if you're going hard, if you're applying for a creative role in marketing, for instance, that they may be looking for creativity. So aside from that, keep the as I say, keep the resume on 2 pages, maximum of 2 pages. And there are lots of templates on the internet. You've probably all done your own searching and found a sort of template that you like, but stick to a template that suits you and keep your introduction, your summary specific, and you need to be prepared to change your summary depending on the role that you're applying for. So
So
you
don't
won't.
have a generic summary and you just send out the same resume to every position you apply to.
Exactly, exactly. Now it's okay to have your course summary, and your course summary is that 3 or 4 line to catch the eyes of the recruiter. Now, typically, a recruiter will spend nanoseconds. I mean, they really are helicoptering very, very quickly, and they will focus on, they know when they're looking at a resume, what's at the back of their mind in terms of what they're looking for, and they will pick out the key salient points right from the get-go. So when you're looking at your summary, look at the job posting. Think about the job posting. What is the company really searching for? And they'll probably repeat certain themes, certain words, certain skill sets. So make sure that those words are reflected in your summary, and keep it, as I said, to 3, 4 sentences maximum. And I know it seems short because each person has got a lot of, you've each got a unique background and skill set, but just keep it short, keep it really succinct, and think about, the job posting.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost like when you go to an ice cream shop and you get the sample, that summary is just that little taste of who you are, and it's got to
Yeah,
be a good flavor to be enough
exactly.
to have to get through to the next step.
Yeah.
What about you're kind of mentioning keywords and sort of
Hmm.
mirroring what the job description is saying the job is about, and matching that in your summary. What about further down in your resume when you look at your job history? How can you have those sections stand out, or have, as the recruiters kind of scanning it and helicoptering over it,
Hmm.
what's going to stand out to them in general, if there is
So
such a thing?
yeah, so you, as most of you probably know, you start off with your current or most recent position. So state clearly the company. If it's obviously they have a website presence. You list the URL for that company and the job that you did. So that's in the first line, and try and keep that to one line. Then the next is the position that you had, and then keep focused on your resume about the achievements that reflect the requirements of the role.
Mm.
So it's not a list of I did this and then I did this and then I did this, because you'll lose a recruiter very quickly.
Mm.
So it's make it very, very achievement orientated. So
What is that recruiter trying to find out on that phone call, and how can you help them find that out?
the recruiter is ultimately, sometimes it's worth putting yourself in the shoes of the recruiter. So what the recruiter is trying to do is to determine, they've got to make a decision at the end of the conversation to say whether they're going to refer you to the next stage. And the next stage is typically with a hiring manager, or maybe somebody within the team that the hiring manager is in. So they want to make that decision, and they're going to say pass or not pass. and they typically approach it saying, okay, I want to pass this candidate. They're not approaching it to try and catch you out. I'm saying typically, because all recruiters are human beings at the end of the day. So you can come up with a recruiter who can be like, that you get the sense of just sort of screening you out.
But most people don't want to waste their own time. So if they've
Correct.
invited you to do the screening call, they've probably got a hunch or a suspicion or a hope that you're a good fit. They wouldn't get on the phone with you if they didn't want to help you pass through. Yeah. So if in that sense, is it, the goal is to not mess up that screening process versus you're not going to land the job on that screening call. And I feel like that I've seen that sometimes where people are trying to win the job and land the job with the recruiter. And they've got they're prepared for what feels like an interview, but you're saying the screening process is a very different step in the journey.
Yeah, as I say, the screening process is trying to get through that filter quickly, and the recruiter is really going to just knock off the key requirements for the role. Again, it really is like, like a dating a dating call, if you like. Just matching. It's the same, you're matching the job requirements to the candidate that you're talking to, and it really is going through that process. And so be prepared, and you need to think about what it, that again, go back to that job posting and think about sticking to the key points of that job posting, the skills, key requirements that job posting is asking for, and accept that you may not have 100% of it. Might not be, because we all look at job postings and think, this is impossible. They're asking for the moon and beyond.
The list of requirements and job responsibilities is like got 15 bullet points each.
But
are you saying there's probably, a handful that are really the most important?
Yeah, and I think if you think about the job and obviously within that career sector, you probably have some idea what if you're obviously applying for it, you've got some, some experience relevant to the position. So you probably have some knowledge about what they're really looking for. So pick out what it is you think they need, and be upfront about if there's an area of experience you don't have. So again, I've always been impressed with candidates who come to me and say, if they ask do you have this skill or this experience or so on, or they might approach you and say, I see there's a gap. I like what you've done so far, but I see there's a gap in your experience, and say, yeah, absolutely. I recognize that when I went through the job posting. However, here's what I'm going to be doing to overcome that gap, and I'm confident that I can do that through studying in my own time, or taking some learning or development, and so on and so on. So jump to the next sort of action, be action orientated about it, and accept, there is a gap. I acknowledge it, and this is what I'm going to do to overcome it.
Yeah, so don't try to minimize a gap in your skill or just explain it away. Own where there are maybe gaps in your experience. And if anything, that will give you more credibility and trust if you're a fit in other areas to get through the process.
Yeah, because ultimately they want to see that you've got the right attitude, you've got an appetite for learning, you've got an appetite for development, you can fit into the culture of their company. And typically a recruiter, they want candidates that are keen, and I've hired, in all honesty, I've hired candidates that probably could have only 25% of what the hiring manager was originally looking for, but they've got a raw talent that is unique to that person, and then and you're absolutely confident as the recruiter that they're going to go on and have be a brilliant at their role. And I wouldn't say I'm right every time. I've made mistakes like any any recruiter. We've all made mistakes, and so but I have hired people, and it's worked out great, and they've gone on to be, had great careers in different companies. So
I'm sure there's been situations where you've hired people where even on paper they fulfilled 100% of the job skill set and requirements, but then culturally or attitude wise, they weren't a fit and they're there for a little bit and then they're gone. I've seen that so many times in my own career. People come in and they look like they're perfect on paper and then they are not a fit. How can, is it possible or appropriate for you as the candidate to ask questions to the recruiter on the screening process? How much of it is a one-way conversation where the recruiter is seeing if they want to date you versus any kind of other questions of asking them questions about the company or the fit, or should the candidate be asking questions? And if so, what should they be asking on the screening call?
Well, a good recruiter and a good recruiter can, sometimes our interviews vary from person to person. So for instance, I started interviews where you've almost, as a recruiter, in your mindset what your questions are going to be. You've got a list of questions where they've got it written down or they've got it on screen or however they tend to do it. You can start off with your one question on the list, but there's so much engagement and chemistry with the candidate, it just becomes a conversation. And that's, in my experience, one of the sort of better type of interviews. And don't, be okay to be sort of go off piste a bit with the recruiter. If that's the way they want to take it, that's fine. And you can, if you're astute enough, you can, as a candidate, you can lead the recruiter into a certain sort of area that you want to go into, because that it really brings out your experience. So, some recruiters might start off with, just tell me a bit about yourself. Simple question, right? But it's a loaded question.
Yes, what you choose to answer in that one question is massive.
It's like that question is golden for the candidate. Absolutely, it's a peach. It's the best question you can start off. But I've seen so many people stumble at that question, and do you want me to talk about my personal life, or yeah, no, yeah, it's like, no, this is an interview. They don't want you to sort of share your problems and issues and argument that might have had with your boyfriend, or your, dog's been sick or something else.
But you've heard all of that.
I've heard it all, plus some more. And so if you get that golden question, be prepared to how you're going to answer that question. And there isn't any right or wrongs in it, because as I say, everybody's unique to themselves. How you might answer is different from another candidate, and you might both end up being great candidates. So there isn't a science to the answer, but what it does do is to say, as I said, it's the peach, and it gives you time to be able to sort of think about, how would I answer that question? And what relevant key points do I want the recruiter to know about when they then refer me on to the hiring manager and think about, how they then screen you for whether you go forward or not.
Yeah, you've said some great things here just in the conversation so far. One is the idea of putting yourself in the recruiter's shoes or position and understanding that their screening, it might be a very important call to you, but to them, it's one of maybe dozens of phone calls they're making to screen who's going to get through. So understanding that their time might be limited, and they're really trying to help you get through the process, and they're trying to see, are you a fit? They're not necessarily your adversary. These are all important things to keep in mind when you're doing that screening call. And then also having your kind of maybe one or two major points that you would want to make sure they know if they ask you that kind of dream question, or maybe even steer them in that direction to make sure you know what maybe your one or two big talking points are for that screening, why you're a good fit for the role, and what you want to highlight about your experience.
Yeah, and the other area that recruiters really look for are gaps in careers, and gaps are okay, and that's normal, especially in these current times. But what you need to be able to do is explain the gaps and be prepared to explain them, and you can use them as a segue into what you did during a gap if that gap's there. So for instance, you might say, yeah, you'll notice in, my resume, there was a slight gap here. And what I did was during that time, I took these online classes, I did this, I did this, I did some, maybe some voluntary work or whatever, which, in that voluntary work also gave me some experience in this area, and so on. So that's just an example of how to be prepared, because the recruiter, when they're looking at, they're gonna look at any key differences or key issues that might appear during, on the resume and during the screening interview. They're gonna pick these things up. They're trained to hone in on this stuff. Believe me, it's not gonna go past them. So you be prepared to be upfront about it, and also, Ed, it's also okay. It might not feel okay to you as a candidate, but it's also okay to realize that as you go through the screening interview, that this job may not be for you. And you've got, you've got to be able to as much as possible to maintain objectivity. So the hiring manager, I would say, if I can put it into two buckets, are really looking for, and they go much deeper into the skills and knowledge and experience relevant to the role, because a recruiter, for instance, is hiring across all positions, typically all positions across a company, unless you're working. I've worked for Oracle, if you like, and Oracle, we have talent people who are just dedicated to being a technology, recruiter in technology, or recruiter for sales. So they have a lot more experience about the roles. But other companies, you've got one recruiter for
every department, basically
every department. So their knowledge is going. So in some ways, when you applying for the job, and you'll know probably from the size of the company and the title of the recruiter what type of recruiter they are. If they're a sales recruiter, they're going to have a lot of knowledge already. So I went backwards then. So now I'll go forward to your question is, the hiring manager get a lot deeper about the fit. And the other bucket I talked about is the chemistry fit and the team fit. So a manager may have, your 10 people in the team, and you're coming at it, and he's, she may have an open position for maybe one or two positions. So they might be looking for certain chemistry within that team, within the team dynamics. So they might, and it comes somewhat harder to quantify, because you can either be, you don't know, and the hiring manager doesn't really know, and they're kind of trying to figure out themselves. And we've all got to recognize that you get some really good hiring managers who are really good at interviewing, and some are not very good at interviewing.
Well, many people who end up in a hiring manager position were promoted into a management role, and it might be the first time they're in that role, or maybe they've just developed bad habits, and their team has a lot of turnover, and they've never really become good at people development, but they might be technically or proficient in their department or their area of expertise, but they've kind of been shoved into a management position.
Yeah, and don't assume. Obviously don't assume, but it's easy to assume that a hiring manager is, that knowledge person and capable and etc. But that's maybe a point where you decide this isn't going to work for me. This dynamic is not going to work for me. Or you might just have a great chemistry and it's going to be a fit in the role, and that's when it starts, you start sort of getting a little bit excited, and you're happy to be excited about it.
It is very much like dating. It's like you get the warm and fuzzies inside. You're like, oh, this feels like a good fit. This feels like this is going really well. But I think what you're saying is that you're still interviewing the company at this point. It's still a two-way conversation, not necessarily when you get to the hiring manager interview that you are just constantly answering their questions, that you're really engaging in a discovery process.
Yeah, I think now there's so much information available about companies, about positions and so on. It used to be more of a one way, but it's much more now about a dialogue, two-way conversation, and a selection, both, as you said, both ways. And another, as I say, another thing that you need to think about is keeping on track and being specific and using the data and facts to illustrate the strengths. So again, it's not, you don't rely on subjectivity. You've got to still think about what I said earlier, you know, it makes it achievement based. So you've got to keep data, give some specifics, know your stuff. Know your stuff. And if it means that you've got to do some homework, you've got to, what did I do 10 years ago or 5 years ago? How did I do that? What happened there? I've forgotten all about that, because sometimes when we walk away from one job, we just like put it in a box.
Yeah.
So you've got to go into a refresh mode and be prepared.
Yeah, using those, it sounds like using those examples to tell a story that demonstrates a skill. That's a really powerful statement you said, and I want to make sure I slow it down enough so that people can really understand that. What you're saying is use those accomplishments from your previous positions and make sure they're quantifiable if possible. So it's using data to say, this is what was accomplished at this previous job that demonstrates a skill that the hiring manager is looking for.
Exactly that. Yes, exactly.
That's powerful. Yeah. So that you allow that to tell the story and using examples instead of saying subjectively, you know, my old boss really likes me. Or everybody said I did a good job.
Yeah. Try and avoid this everyone and always and those sort of
the very specific examples.
Yeah. Very specific words. And as I say, I think I've mentioned this already, but as I say, the interviews can be quite addictive, and it's a opportunity for you to be on the stage a little bit, if you like. And as I said, you see candidates who treat it as like a counseling session, and this isn't a counseling session. I know I've mentioned that already, but as I say, it happens more often than you think. Because it's addictive, you know, it's addictive to talk about yourself. We all like to have an opportunity to sort of talk about what we've done and what we've achieved. And it's a free format.
But zeroing it in into some specifics that are relevant to the position and not necessarily telling your life story or just constantly performing, you know, what you think everyone wants to hear, the hiring manager wants to hear, just being very specific to the role and the cultural fit. When it comes to, I mean, I had a career in sales, you know, and there was always these kind of closing questions that, you know, I would ask when I was working with a potential customer. Is there a good question, or is it appropriate to ask, you know, at the conclusion of your interview with the hiring manager, if they think you're a good fit, or if they think that a certain part of your expertise is a good fit? Do you have any suggestions around how to, as a candidate, how to close that hiring manager interview?
Absolutely. It's perfectly okay and probably a strength to be able to say, you know, we've gone through the process, you know, we spent 45 minutes here talking about this, and do you know, what's your view? Can you give me some feedback on my, you know, my fit for the role, and where do you perceive the gaps could be? And so pose a question like that, for instance, and, you know, or you might approach it and say, you know, as you know, we've gone through the interview now, and in closing, what I'd like to say is, I think through the discussions, I've identified that probably I don't have X skills or this certain area of knowledge, and I talked about that earlier. And then you can then segue onto, and this is how I would be able to overcome these, and what I'm prepared to do to overcome that. You know, what do you think about that? Do you think that approach would work, etc., etc.
In general, I just hear this overall theme of being authentic and being just more human, having a human conversation between people about, you know, whether this is a fit or not. And I think I've been in situations, and I've seen others in situations where they kind of don't ask those questions at the end of the process, and then they're just crossing their fingers, hoping they get the job. I feel like we could have conversations for hours about these different areas of compensation and interviewing. You've got so much information to offer. I'm so grateful that you spent this time with me, and I hope this has been valuable to the women that have watched this video. Yeah, so I thank you so much.